This is Unit 4A. It's on the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system is made of a number of glands that are spread throughout the body, and these glands produce soluble products which are secreted into the bloodstream, into the blood plasma, and then circulate around the body until they meet up with the right receptor on target cells. So only cells that are acted on by those hormones will respond because they have the appropriate receptor on their surface. So the hormone's secreted and goes through the bloodstream and the blood plasma and will eventually come into contact with the receptor on the appropriate target cells and the appropriate target tissue. Now, it's really a control mechanism that the body has through which it can send signals out to different tissues in order to keep a appropriate balanced state, so that the body is always at the appropriate level of different levels of activity depending on what tissue you're talking about. The endocrine glands include the pituitary gland, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal glands, the pineal, and in this in your book and in the previous diagram they included the thymus, but the thymus is not an endocrine gland. In fact, it is part of the immune system and it is considered to be a primary lymphoid organ, not an endocrine organ. There are some glands which have contain tissue that is not only endocrine but also exocrine. Endocrine, of course, meaning secreted inside the body, and exocrine meaning the product is secreted outside of the body. A good example of an exocrine gland would be the salivary glands that secrete saliva out through ducts into your mouth. But these particular glands that I'm talking about, which have both endocrine and exocrine function and tissue, they have these two different tissues inside of them, and some of their products are secreted into the blood plasma as hormones, and other products are secreted outside. An example of that would be the pancreas and also the gonads, which secrete hormone, that's the endocrine product, and exocrine products. The exocrine products of the pancreas are, of course, the digestive juices, the digestive enzymes that are secreted into the duodenum. And the endocrine products of the pancreas are insulin and glucagon. Whereas for the gonads, they do secrete hormones. In males, testosterone. In females, you have steroid hormones being produced, progesterone and estrogen. And they both also secrete exocrine products. Both organs are releasing or secreting out their reproductive cells, sperm in the case of the male, and eggs in the case of the female. Now, the hypothalamus is also an endocrine organ, but it has mostly a combination of neural function and hormone release, and it is considered always a part of the brain. But there is glandular tissue there that secretes hormone. There are other tissues also and organs that can produce some hormones, not that they would be necessarily at all considered endocrine glands, because their major function, most of their tissue is taken up with other functions. But adipose cells, fat cells, can secrete hormone. You have pockets of cells in the wall of the small intestine the enteroendocrine cells that you learned about, which secrete certain hormones. The stomach also, in the wall, you have secretion of hormones. Kidneys, of course, secrete erythropoietin, it's an important hormone, and the heart can secrete atrial natriuretic factor, or ANF. So I think I've mentioned all of these now. The pineal gland, which is located in here, it's actually part of the diencephalon. And the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, pancreas, which is mixed, endocrine and exocrine, and then the ovaries and the testes in the male, the gonads, in other words, female and male, which secrete release eggs or sperm, but also produce hormones. Okay, now some organs will secrete products that act on the cells inside that organ that's secreting them, and these products are called autocrine secretions or autocrine chemicals. Other tissues will secrete molecules that will act locally on other cells, different cells from the ones that secrete them, but locally within the tissue, right next door. These molecules aren't considered hormones, since hormones are acting as longer distance chemical signals that get secreted normally into the bloodstream, into the blood plasma, and then have an effect at a distance on cells or tissues that have the right appropriate receptor for that hormone. So in general, the overall effect of hormones is that they will regulate the metabolic function of other cells, and depending on what those other cells are capable of, it'll be different metabolic functions. There are lag times, delays between when the hormone binds to the target cell and when the effect is seen. It can be seconds, or it can be even hours, or sometimes even days. And in general, hormones have not a short-term, quick, instantaneous effect, but tend to have a long, overall, prolonged effect over an extended period of time. Even though they're all called hormones, the molecules, there are quite a few drastically different types of molecules that have hormonal function, and these include amino acid based peptide hormones. Small proteins are called peptides, and they're made up of amino acids. And also steroids, or some of the hormones are steroids, some are eicosanoids. The amino acid based ones cover, in other words, protein type hormones, cover most of the hormones. And that includes some amines, the thyroxine produced by the thyroid gland, and different protein or peptide hormones. There's many, and I'll explain which ones are proteins later. Steroids are produced by the gonads. These are gonadal hormones, and also adrenal cortical hormones. Adrenal cortical hormones are hormones that are produced by within the adrenal gland, so it's adreno, and produced by the cortex of the adrenal gland. Okay, so it's adrenocortical hormones. Remember that the adrenal medulla produces norepinephrine, epinephrine, the catecholamines, in other words, that get secreted out and have neurotransmitter-like effects. But in the cortex of the adrenal, There's production of adrenal cortical hormones, and these are steroid hormones. There are also eicosanoids, the third class, and these include a large number of molecules that are called leukotrienes, as a whole family, and also another whole family of molecules called prostaglandins. These are lipids that have hormone-like activity. And there's a whole variety of them, and they're produced by a whole variety of different tissues. Okay, now this next section, I don't need you to know a lot of the detail. That's more signaling inside cells and biochemical molecules in the cells. I just want you to know overall the general gist of it. Essentially, as you know, that hormones will alter their target cell activity, and they do that by through one of two mechanisms. They are either going to trigger production inside the target cell. Once the hormone binds to its specific receptor on the surface, you will get secondary messengers inside the cell that get activated and mediate the effect on the inside of the cell. And associated with that are, inside the cell at least, are things, molecules called G proteins, and also most of the amino acid or protein-based hormones act in this way. The other major type of mechanism involving hormones is through direct gene activation. And this is what is occurring not with protein hormones that act in this way, but with steroid hormones. Steroid hormones, because they're of their molecular characteristic, are able, they don't need to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell, on the cell's membrane surface. They can actually move right through the cell membrane, the plasma membrane or cell membrane. They move right through into the cytoplasm and interact with a receptor, or even, and then go into the nucleus, or even go into the nucleus and interact with a receptor there. And they will activate genes directly. So it's a direct activation by entry of the hormone into the cell, and then combination with some sort of receptor, and then the complex interacts with the gene. As I said, whatever the response is, the exact response is, depends on the hormone, the target cell type, and its receptor for both of these. So, you know, you can get all kinds of, and again, this is just general, you can get all kinds of cellular changes in target cells, depending, of course, what the hormone is, what the target is, what the target cells are capable of. You could get and these are just general terms. You might get a change in plasma membrane permeability, or stimulation of a particular protein, or activation of some enzyme, or induction of a secretory activity. It may trigger the target cell to start secreting something else, another hormone or some other protein, or it might stimulate the cell into dividing. So there's many mechanisms that are activated. There's many responses in the target cells, or cellular changes in the target cells. The protein-based or amino acid-based type of hormone action, I said, involves secondary messenger. In one case, the secondary messenger is cyclic AMP, or CAMP. And when I talk about these messengers, they're on the inside of the cell. So the hormone binds to the receptor on the outside, and the hormone is the first receptor. And it goes through a series of steps that involve a G protein, and then it will trigger production. All these different steps, which I don't need you to know in great detail, will generate cyclic AMP, trigger production of cyclic AMP, which is the second messenger. So the first messenger is the hormone, which binds to a protein on the cell surface, and that causes a change in the receptor such that it triggers production of cyclic AMP, the secondary messenger, or the second messenger inside the cell. And then this later has further effects that cause the cellular changes, typical of that original protein interaction. And this is a diagram that shows that kind of thing, where here you have the first messenger, the hormone, interacting with a specific receptor, and then through a series of steps resulting in a second messenger, in this case cyclic AMP, and that triggers in the end the target cell response, which could be one of many different things depending upon the hormone and the target cell. But they're all and these are all general types of changes. The kind of hormones that do this are listed here. I wouldn't expect you to know them or memorize them all, but they are, for the most part, not all, but for the most part, protein or amino acid based. Now, another type of second messenger involves, again, the first signal, a hormone binding to a receptor, and again, a G protein inside the cell, activating two secondary messengers, and the two are called DAG and IP3. Again, you don't have to worry about it, but know that it's a sequence of events. In the end, what happens is there's a release of calcium from stores inside the cell, and the calcium will act as the third messenger to trigger the particular cell response that's wanted, or that's triggered by that hormone. So there's the first messenger, the hormone, the two secondary messengers, these two molecules, and then the third messenger is calcium. And again, here you see that first messenger interacting with interacting with its receptor, and then a G protein is involved, here, and you get the two secondary messengers, IP3, and the other one, and then you get the release of calcium, the third messenger, and you get the final response of the target cell. And these, again, don't memorize these, but these different, mostly protein-based molecules or hormones act through this kind of pathway. So those were two types of hormone actions involving amino acid-based hormones. And then the third type was steroid-based hormones. So steroid hormones and also thyroid hormone, as I said, they can easily go right through a cell membrane. They don't have to interact with a receptor on the surface of the target cell. They go in and then they bind to an intracellular receptor. And then this complex will go into the nucleus through the nuclear membrane, a second phospholipid bilayer, right? The nuclear membrane around the nucleus is a phospholipid bilayer, just like the cell membrane on the outside. And there it binds to a protein on DNA, and you trigger DNA transcription to get messenger, and the messenger becomes protein, and that is the cellular effect, the induction of this particular protein. So steroid hormones are quite different from protein hormones or amino acid-based hormones in that they go right through the cell membrane, bind to an intracellular receptor, then move that complex, hormone receptor complex moves into the nucleus and will interact with DNA to trigger transcription and translation into proteins. And here you see an example of that, where this steroid hormone is moving right in, doesn't get stopped by and can move right through. It's completely soluble because of its chemical nature. It's completely soluble, interacts with a receptor, and the receptor hormone complex then will see it's going right through. In this case, by the way, in this diagram, the receptor is in the nucleus. Sometimes it can be outside, but in the nucleus. The receptor hormone complex interacts with the DNA, and you get transcription to messenger RNA, which goes out to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or I'm sorry, to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, where you have ribosomes, and you get translation to protein. So that's the end result of that. That new protein is the end result of the hormone, of the cell being exposed to that hormone. So you can see that these amino acid or protein peptide-based hormones interact with their target cells very differently from steroid hormones. So as I said earlier in this slide, I'm repeating what I said earlier, the hormones circulate around but only trigger or interact or activate their target cells, right? Target cells have to have specific receptors that the hormone can bind to, and those receptors may be intracellular, as is the case with steroid hormones, or located on the surface, on the plasma membrane. Examples of these are, and there's thousands of different examples: insulin, all the different hormones, protein hormones. These are two out of many interactions. ACTH receptors are only found on certain cells of the adrenal cortex. Okay. Adrenal cortical hormones produced by the adrenal cortex. The tissue in the adrenal cortex will respond to this hormone, okay, ACTH, and they have on their surface this receptor specific for ACTH, so they are able to respond to ACTH. That's a very restricted, and usually it's, for most hormones, the tissue that can respond is restricted to very specific tissues. There are some hormones that all the cells in the body have receptors for that. An example of that would be thyroxine, the thyroid hormone, which can interact with thyroid receptors that are found on nearly all the cells in the body. Or another example would be insulin, which can interact with insulin receptors that are found on all the cells in the body. So again, nevertheless, whether the receptor is found on very restricted number of tissues or all the tissues or most tissues, the hormone must act through, and can only act through, binding to its specific target receptor. And with that interaction, in order to get that kind of target cell activation, there are three factors that are key to that: the actual level of the hormone present, so the blood levels of the hormone. Remember, hormones are always released into the bloodstream. The number of receptors on the surface of the target cell, and it can vary. If there's a low number or a high number, the response can be different. And how tightly the receptors can bind that hormone, so the affinity of the receptors for the hormone. So how much hormone, how many receptors on the surface of the cell, and how high is the affinity, or low is the affinity of the receptors for the hormone. If in certain circumstances you can get changes not only in the level of hormone being released into the bloodstream, but you can get changes in the number of receptors on the surface of the cell with upregulation. Some target cells can form more hormones in response to the presence of their, if there's more of a particular hormone around, some cells can start expressing more receptors so that they can bind and interact with it. Or in some situations, again, depending on the tissue, depending on the situation, sometimes you get a down regulation of the receptor where target cells lose receptors in response to the hormone. So it's not it's quite a dynamic kind of always changing kind of situation. The hormone receptor interactions and the dynamics of it all. It can get fairly complicated, the interactions. And now I think we'll start talking about some of the specific hormones, the glands that produce them and their targets. One thing I should mention, though, is that hormones will circulate in the blood typically in either one or of two forms. Either they'll be free-floating, freely circulating in soluble form in the bloodstream, or sometimes they have to be bound by specific binding molecules. So steroids and thyroid hormones are typically bound to a particular plasma protein, and all the others are free. So the other types of hormones, all of which are protein-based, amino acid-based, they float free. But steroids and thyroid hormone are bound to a particular type of binding proteins that are specific type of binding proteins that are found in the blood plasma. The concentration of a hormone can change in the blood depending on the situation, the person, their health, their age, their activity, what signals they're getting, what kind of environment they're in. But the concentrations vary within the bloodstream, of course, depending not if you just look at the level in the bloodstream, it depends on the rate of release of the hormone, but also you have to keep in mind the level of hormone in the plasma will depend on how fast it gets inactivated. Okay, so hormones released and it's floating around, but it's not going to be there forever. The molecules aren't immortal, and they don't stay in that form forever. They start to break down or get inactivated and removed from the body. And removal can involve certain enzymes that degrade them, or removal can be due to the kidneys actually excreting it or putting the hormone out in the filtrate and not reabsorbing it, or it could be due to liver enzyme systems that can break it down. So a lot of things can break down hormones. The other thing, of course, you should always keep in mind that the hormone level in the bloodstream will drop if it's being taken up by a lot of cells and being used by cells. For example, like the hormone the type of hormones that go into cells and bind to a receptor and form a complex inside cells. But an actual removal from the body completely can be due to degradation or kidney filtration or liver enzyme breakdown. Okay. In general, I thought we were going to get faster into the specific hormones, but there's a few more things that I should cover. Overall general topics about hormones. There are three types of hormone interactions that you should be aware of. One is permissiveness, another is synergism, and the third is antagonism. In permissive types of hormone interactions, you need, in order for one hormone to act, it needs the action of another. Okay, so it's this second hormone here the other hormone is permitting it to act. Okay, it needs that other hormone in order to mediate its effect. In synergism, you have more than one hormone producing an effect in a target cell, but the combined effect is greater than the sum of the individual effect. If one hormone increases a particular activity twofold and the other hormone increases the activity tenfold, it's not an additive. It's not a 12-fold. It's a multiple effect, a combined effect that's magnified greatly. And in antagonist type of interactions, one hormone can oppose the action of another hormone on a particular target cell. So you can have either permission through a second hormone, or synergism between two hormones, or antagonism where one hormone interferes with the other. Typically, release of hormones into the blood plasma and the bloodstream is controlled through negative feedback systems where, if there's a particular hormone gets released because the situation is that the body needs it and the signals are sent and the hormone gets released, then it starts to mediate its effect, and the fact that its effect is starting to occur and it's building has a negative feedback on the production. So it causes that hormone to slow down, the production, the release of it to slow down, and in this way maintains it within the narrow desirable range that's needed by the body. Now, the kinds of things that will initially trigger release, synthesis and release, that I talked about, when the hormone starts being synthesized and released and then has its effect on its target, and then whatever that effect is has a negative effect on synthesis and release. So that's a negative effect there, negative feedback. The kind of initial stimuli that causes production of the hormone can be either humoral, which is something in the blood plasma in the presence of a particular substance in the blood plasma, or due to neural stimulus, something from the nervous system stimulating, or another hormone causing the stimulus. Humoral stimulus or humoral stimuli, examples of the different, there's quite a few different examples. The example I'm going to show here involves calcium. Because the concentration of calcium ions in the blood has to be very carefully and tightly controlled. And if the calcium is essential for many important metabolic functions and pathways in the body, if the concentration of calcium is dropping, then, and humoral here refers to plasma level, okay, blood level. So if the blood calcium level is dropping, that will stimulate parathyroid glands to secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH. Parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone will cause calcium concentrations or levels to rise. And that, of course, removes the initial stimulus. The initial stimulus is the declining level of calcium, right? So that's a humoral stimulus. Stimulus from the level in the blood plasma. That's just one example. A neural, and the parathyroid glands, by the way, are these four, you see these four tiny, fairly small, really, glands. I'm going to do it. These fairly small glands associated with the thyroid gland, they're actually dorsal. behind the posterior to the thyroid gland. An example of a humoral stimulus, this is of course an example of a humoral stimulus, and what I was describing earlier is shown here. Blood capillary, blood levels of calcium, if they're low, will stimulate the parathyroid organs to start releasing PTH, and the PTH acts in a number of different ways to increase calcium levels, and that shuts down the stimulus for PTH release, so a negative feedback response. A neural stimulus involves the nervous system, and an example of that would be the preganglionic sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, sometimes called the sympathetic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic division, can send signals out directly to the adrenal medulla, okay, which is the interior part of the adrenal glands on top of each kidney, and that will trigger them to secrete neurotransmitter type hormones into the bloodstream, norepinephrine and epinephrine. And then the third type of stimulus for hormone release can be hormones themselves. So this is a case of hormones getting released in response to hormones produced by other endocrine organs. And a major example of that would be the hormones that the hypothalamus produces. The hypothalamus will produce a number of organs that can stimulate the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has two lobes, an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. And the anterior lobe is affected by hypothalamic hormones produced and released by the hypothalamus. They act on the anterior lobe and trigger the anterior lobe of the pituitary and trigger particular pituitary hormones to be released, which will then into the bloodstream, which will stimulate their targets to secrete other hormones. So you have a two-step: hormones from the hypothalamus acting on the anterior lobe of the pituitary, triggering it to release hormones that act on other organs and triggering those organs also to release hormones. So it's actually two steps in that chain, that where a hormone triggers release of some other tissue to produce a hormone. These are anterior lobe of the pituitary gland responses. Overall, activity of the endocrine glands can be modified by the nervous system. Not just, and I'm not just talking here about neural stimuli, but in general, the nervous system can have an effect on endocrine glands, and also have an effect on the negative feedback mechanism. It can override certain controls that are normally present. An example of that would be blood changes in blood glucose level because of sympathetic nervous output. Normally it's the endocrine system that will maintain and control blood glucose levels through the action of the pancreas, but under stress the body needs more glucose, and both the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system will be activated and trigger responses that increase glucose availability in the body. Okay, so I think we could stop there. This would be the end of Unit 4, Part 1.